Um, so I'm keen from the session today just to outline those kind of key sustainability metrics, as well as a high level on how we can go about calculating those metrics. So about myself, so I am a chartered environmentalist, so I have my chartership. I also have a master's in climate change, science and policy. So I'm hoping I know my stuff to talk to you today around this piece. At the moment, I am the climate reporting and communications lead at NatWest for our own operations. So I lead a team that calculate our footprint, we communicate that internally, we communicate that externally, and then we really look at setting what our ambitions and what those metrics are, as well as how we track against those. So it's around setting that direction of travel for our own operation. So that is how we run our branches, run our buildings, how our colleagues get into the office, how they work from home. So really focusing on our colleague-centric side of emissions. Just for a bit of engagement, if you feel comfortable popping into the chat, just your name, the company that you're with, and then also what you're hoping to get out of today's session, we can then follow up with that at the end, just to really make sure that we've kind of hit the mark on what you're really hoping to get from today. So great to start to see some activity there. So when we look at metrics, this is quite an overwhelming slide, so apologies, it's a lot to take in. But what we need to have when we think of metrics is we really need to have SMART metrics, and SMART acronym being they need to be smart. So they need to be measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So really having the specific metric that you can quantitatively measure and that are relevant to what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. And then you have that time-bound piece. So you have your baseline, and then you have your ambition target date. So, I want to achieve a 20% reduction in my business travel emissions between 2019 and 2024, let's say. So you really start to specify it out. You have your dates and you have that quantifiable value that you're trying to achieve as part of that ambition. And part of having that metric is really MMMR, to use the acronym. So it's starting out with that measurement. So you have that baseline piece. So you understand where you're starting from so that you can know where you're trying to get to. You have to understand that baseline piece so that you know your current impact, as well as the kind of material areas that you can influence and then reduce and impact. So starting out in that measuring space. From that point, you can then move into monitoring. So you've done your measurement, you can then do that same measurement over a period of time to understand that direction of movement. So at NatWest, we report our footprint every month internally, so we can really track that progress and we can really start to influence direction. We understand our direction of travel and the speed of travel and how on track we are to meet our kind of ambitions for the year. So that monitoring piece can enable change in internal policy. It can help you nudge things in the right direction if they're not going there fast enough, or if they're going too quickly. You can understand that and you can really start to update your ambition to be in line with that kind of accelerated timeline. So you have your measurements, you're monitoring it so you know how fast you're going and where you're going. Then you can look at that SMART metric of, right, I've been reducing 5% every month for the past 3 months. I've got that direction of travel. Where do I want to get to? How fast can I get there? Do I need to continue monitoring for a longer period of time before I understand what that end destination could be, or what does that look like? And so you can really start then to set that SMART metric. And I think a key piece around setting any metric there is that it is achievable, and how you're going to get there is a kind of a known journey. So you're not saying, I'm going to reduce by 90% in a year, and you don't know how you're going to achieve that. You're not on track to achieve that. You're currently at a 5% reduction and you've set this massive ambition. Really enabling that journey to be understood. So what is your transition plan to get there? How will you achieve that metric? It's a really core part of it, so that you're not setting yourself up for failure, you're really setting yourself up for success and driving the right behaviors. Yes, it can be ambitious. Yes, you still want it to be something to aim for that you're keen to get to, but having that understood journey of how, what are you going to do? Do you have the budget to be able to do that? Are you engaging the right people to drive that change? Really needs to be understood as part of that SMART metric. So that is that A of achievable and SMART. It's really core within your metrics. So once you've measured, you've monitored, you've set that metric, it's then about reducing. So you've set your metric, you've got your direction of travel, you've got your transition plan of how you're going to achieve that metric or that ambition that you've set. You're then really tracking progress against that so that you can drive those reductions. So you're implementing the actions that you need to, you're having conversations with the right parties, whether that's charities that can help you, if that's the local government that can help you understand the policies, if it's actually engaging your colleagues or employees, or if you're in a shared building, the other people around you. If we take that waste as an example, are you recycling everything that you could be? Are you doing that correctly? Really trying to drive the right behaviors to have that wider engagement and wider impact. Once you're at that point, you then go back to your measurement, so you can then re-understand where you are, where have you got to within that year or that period, and then the loop begins again around monitoring, tracking against progress. Is the metrics still relevant for what you're trying to do? Is it still achievable, or actually has something happened that's changed your operations? So your absolute reduction target, your business has expanded massively, and that's no longer a relevant metric for you to have. So really checking in on those and making sure that those are still relevant for what you are doing. So that's kind of the piece behind the metrics. But when we dig down into the specifics of what could or should those metrics be, I think it's key to note that material metrics will differ depending on the industry that your business is in. So if you are a company that is producing beverages, water will be really key to what you do because you'll need to consume it to create your product. Whereas as us as a financial institution, our water is mainly for our bathrooms or for our kitchen facilities. So if I want to have a glass of water, so our water is much less impactful, it's much less material to our operations than it would be to a beverage producer. So having that in mind whilst we work through these, I've put down kind of 5 core areas, but their materiality or their impact will vary depending on what you and your business do. So these are in no particular order. As I say, it'll be specific to the area that you're in. But starting off with your energy consumption, and by energy, I don't mean just electricity, I mean everything that can create energy for you. So that's if you have boilers in your building to create your heating, or your hot water, that will use some form of fuel. If that's natural gas, it could be heating fuel, it could be diesel if it's a large generator piece. So really digging down into exactly what energy you are consuming and how much of that as well. So trying to drive firstly that reduction in energy piece. So from if we take the natural gas perspective, is your thermostat set so you quite like it quite warm and you like to sit in a t-shirt even when it's really cold outside? Actually, could you turn that down to save both energy and money on that piece? If you have a diesel for a backup generator, how often do you need to test that generator to make sure it's functional? How often are you having to use that generator? Are there other intervention methods that you could implement on site to help reduce that? Or are there other fuels you could use in the generator, like red diesel or biofuel, to really enable more sustainable consumption of fuel as well as that reduction piece? So that reduction as well as sustainable consumption piece. So for electricity, are you engaged with your provider around moving potentially to a renewable electricity tariff? So not necessarily for a direct feed in, so not necessarily for just solar panels on your building, or you live right next to a wind farm so you can have that direct feed in, but is that energy provider adding additional renewables to the grid? Are they engaged in building new renewable sites across the country that they are greening the UK's or your local area's grid? It's wider than just what you are consuming. It is kind of adding to that national grid and that national greening piece. So that's the first one there on energy. So it's energy reduction as well as increased sustainability of that energy that you are consuming. And the two go hand in hand, and they should be kind of used together to really drive the right behaviors there. The second metric is then on waste. So we briefly touched on the recycling piece. So it's again a duality of reducing it and being more sustainable with what you produce and consume. So from a reduction perspective, are you seeing people every day bringing in their coffees in the local cafes, single use cup, or are people bringing in their own returnables, their own reusable items? So you're reducing that waste piece. Do you then have understanding or sight of where that waste goes? So you put it into your general waste bin and you walk away, but where does that go? Does that go to a landfill site? Does that go to an energy incineration for that energy recovery piece? So is that waste being used again for alternative purposes, or is it going to landfill? So really starting to unpick the waste journey that your building or your shared building might be on to help drive further impact. So at NatWest, as an example, we have a zero waste to landfill where achievable ambition, because we have really rural sites where there isn't an alternative nearby. It would be higher carbon emissions to send it to the energy incineration plant than it would be to send it to the landfill site. So it really depends on the infrastructure that's available, that wider impact, and then what's within your influence in terms of that building and in terms of the policies that you can have. The next piece is then on water, and again a duality to this metric. So it's can you reduce the amount of water that you consume as an operation? So do you have any rainwater harvesting as part of that building for any kind of water that's not being drank, so like water that you can capture that can be used in bathrooms? Do you have low water flow taps to really help reduce that water consumption piece? But then equally, understanding where you are in terms of water sensitivity. So are you operating in an area that has low water availability? So if I take myself as an example, in my home, I'm in the southeast. Last summer we had pretty much a summer long hosepipe ban. So I know I'm in an area of quite a lot of heightened water sensitivity and low water availability. So really understanding the geography of where you're based and that water availability piece to tie in as well alongside that reductions. So you're making impact where it matters most. So you have that materiality aspect. We have our material consumption. So this sort of links in with the waste piece. So really thinking about kind of circularity of our economy. So what are you consuming? Do you need to consume it? Can you reduce what you're consuming? So, are you consuming a lot of paper? Actually, could you move that to be online? So sending an email rather than a letter. Are you using a lot of printer ink, or kind of looking at those tangible items that you're consuming? Are they creating a lot of waste? Can you reduce that consumption? That will then positively impact your waste as well as your wider impact on material use. And then finally, the least tangible of all of the metrics is then the carbon emissions. The others are kind of physical things that you can see. I mean, you can see your natural gas in the boiler being used. I can see the small flame in it. I can see the electricity because I turn the light switch on and off, or the waste or the water. But carbon's not something that is so tangible. It's really hard to envisage impact. So using that kind of emission factors from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. It used to be DEFRA. It's now the DSENS or DSANS acronym, but really starting to convert that consumption piece into carbon and understanding that impact, and then being able to relay that internally. That is the kind of the large challenge of this metric, is trying to get it understandable and tangible. So questions like the impact of your flights versus rail and how many times you can do those are really giving it equivalencies that make it tangible and sensible for people to understand. So when we talk about the consumption metrics, so we had the kind of energy, the water, material consumption, your waste production. It's kind of four, so this is at high level, it's kind of four key steps to really understand what that metric could be and how you can track that metric in terms of what that means. So if we take our electricity as an example, and I've put on the side, I'll come back to landlord properties. I've got that on the side for now because I know that can be slightly different. But you might receive your invoice or your bill from your utility provider saying, you know, you've consumed this many kilowatt hours of electricity this month. Year to date, it's this month, and then here's how much you have to pay us for the privilege of consuming that energy or that water. So firstly, gathering those invoices and focusing on that consumption piece. So, you know, how many kilowatt hours did we consume this month? Do we have a smart meter in place that can really pull that out, or are we reliant on those kind of estimated bills? And entering it then into something that you can track. So whether that's a spreadsheet, if you like, kind of those digitized tools, or just noting it down and keeping a log of it kind of written of exactly how many kilowatt hours are we consuming. You can then pull together that kind of annualized view. So we have that measure, we have that monitor, and we're now looking then at that metric of, okay, I've consumed this many this year. What do I want to reduce by? What's the impact of that? And if you're building a business case to set that metric internally, you know, you can also focus on what the pound saving could be from that as well, because you'll have that within that invoice. So if you see that your 10 kilowatt hours is costing you, let's say 10 pence, you can then start to extrapolate that out of, okay, if I save 100 kilowatt hours, you know, that could be £1, and it can go further and further. So you can really start to tie in your environmental and sustainability metrics with that kind of wider economic and business case elements for those, which can help firstly with internal engagement and agreement on those, but then also on delivery and investment in CapEx to drive those reductions and achieve those reductions. If you're in a kind of a landlord property and your cost of utilities are included as part of that rent, I know that's something we struggle with in some of our properties is, you know, we pay one fee to cover all of the utilities as well as being in that building. So really starting to engage in that dialogue with your landlords to understand, you know, can they provide the breakdown of what you're consuming? Do they have that data either at a building level or a floor level, or a kind of per person or per desk level if you're in kind of a shared office space? You know, what level of detail can they provide you with that you can start to understand your impact? You know, if you have a whole level in a building, you know, can you get a smart meter installed to understand your energy consumption? Is that one of those investment opportunities that you can really start to business case internally to understand consumption to then drive reduction? So just starting to engage in that dialogue or to understand what data and information is available, because it all boils down to that data and information piece to enable those smart metrics around sustainability and that consumption piece. When we focus in then on carbon, it starts to get much more difficult, much more quickly. So on the screen at the moment, this is what's called the greenhouse gas protocol. So this is the way that we account for our carbon in 3 different scopes. So at the top, we've got all of the different greenhouse gases that fall into that small e when we talk about TCO2e. So it's making all of those equivalent so you can have one number rather than lots of different numbers. So when we talk about carbon emissions, we have our 3 scopes. So we have our scope 1, which is our direct emissions. And the easiest way to think about scope 1 is any fuel that you yourself burn directly, either on site or in a vehicle that's owned or leased very long term by your company. So that is your natural gas in boilers, diesel in generators. If you have any persons that the company pays for the car for them to drive around because they have to drive a set amount of mileage, any of the fuel that's used to run that car, you know, you're burning it directly by turning on that ignition. So that all falls into your scope 1. Your scope 2 is then your indirect energy consumption. So that is mostly electricity, but it can also be if you consume district heating or district cooling. because you and your organization, you're not burning the fuel directly to create that energy. You're just consuming the outputs of that. You're consuming the electricity or the heat or the cold air. So that falls into scope 2. We've then got scope 3, which is everything else. Everything else is included in scope 3. And some accountants struggle with the concept of scope 3 because it's purposefully double counting. So your scope 3 will be another company's scope 1 and 2. So yes, it's double counting, but that is the purpose of it and its design. So that can be quite a difficult concept to explain to accountants or explain to auditors around why that exists. But within our scope 3, we've got our upstream activities, which is kind of everything that happens pre-customer. And then we've got our downstream activities, which is kind of how the customer uses the product and where that ends up. So when we spoke in the previous slide around looking at our material consumption, our energy consumption, our waste production, I've kind of circled the parts of the greenhouse gas protocol that falls into. So it would be mostly your scope 1 and scope 2, where you have your energy invoices, you have your energy bills, you're really able to convert consumption directly into emissions. And I've got a slide following on exactly how to do that. But you can take your consumption and you can convert it to emissions through that. A similar process with waste, if you understand your waste tonnage, you understand where that waste is going to. So, is it being reused or recycled? Is it going to incineration with energy recovery, or is it going to landfill? You can really start to understand the emissions impact of that. Another one that you can start to track could be your business travel. So are you booking flights? Are you booking rail trips as part of that? Again, you'll have the consumption value in terms of, I took a train from London to Edinburgh, so you can calculate the kilometers of distance, which you can then convert into emissions. And the same with flights. You've booked a flight from A to B, you can calculate the distance and then convert that consumption into carbon. So that can be another one to track. And when we think about kind of influencing scope 3 emissions, business travel can be a really impactful way that you can have an influence, even if you're not in a position or kind of higher up in the organization. That's an area you can still lobby and you can still impact and influence, because firstly, it directly correlates to spend. So you can have, again, that ease of business case around reduction in business travel, reducing carbon, yes, but also reducing costs. So you can change that language quite easily within the business case for that metric. The data's available for it, and you can engage colleagues on the impact as well. So it's, you've taken a flight from Bristol down to Devon, why didn't you get the train? Really understanding the drivers that can sit behind those decisions within that business travel piece. Was that piece of travel necessary, or actually could you have done that online? Really starting to unpick at the drivers behind it. And that can be through kind of internal engagement webinars around impact. That can just be through kind of coffee conversations around what people are doing within the organization and trying to drive those behaviors around reducing travel where you can, and then traveling more sustainably where travel still has to happen. So I think business travel is a great area for that influence around scope 3. Another area could be your purchase goods and services. So that is every single thing that your company might buy, if it's a tangible good or if it's a service that a company's providing. So, you might be needing cloud web-based hosting, looking at which cloud you're going to, do they have metrics and targets of themselves? Are they reporting their progress against their sustainability for that cloud provider? So really just starting to, again, engage people in conversations, is sustainability being considered as part of that contract or that decision making, and taking that forward. So I've got an example calculation on the screen at the moment of how to take that consumption piece and convert it into your emissions. So I have the different types on the left-hand side. I've made up some different consumption pieces in that kind of annual consumption column. We then have the kind of the DCENS emission factors. So those are publicly available. They're published every year by the UK government, and it is a conversion of consumption from a set unit into your carbon emissions. So they have ones for, if I take flights as an example, flight is split out into domestic, short haul, and long haul, and then every different class of seat that you could have. So might not know if what class someone's gone in. They might have been in economy or premium economy, business first. Each of those has a different carbon impact because you're taking up a different amount of the plane and therefore accounting for either more or less of the carbon emissions associated with that plane journey. So really starting to delve into that. So they provide a whole plethora of emission factors, and those are all publicly available on the DCEN's website. So if you Google emission factor 2023 UK, it should come up. And as I say, that's annual. So we're expecting the 2024 factors to come out in the next few weeks. It's June sometime. So fingers crossed it's soon so we can really start to unpick the impacts as well. So, what has the UK electricity grid done? Has it decarbonised over the past year? And start to understand that impact. And you can then have those emissions, and you can then start to unpick those equivalencies. So you can see the impact of that flight versus that rail journey, or the impact of sending the waste to landfill rather than sending it to be recycled. As you can see the impact of the emission factor there of 21 versus almost 500. So it's really impactful sending it to landfill versus trying to recycle that piece of waste. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to canter through the next few slides of these are just some examples of the metrics that my team reports as part of our own operations. You can see we have our kind of energy, our electricity being renewable, as well as our kind of energy reduction metric and ambition. We have our emissions ambition, we've got electric vehicle ambitions, and then we've got those resource use around waste and around how much paper we're consuming. So really trying to spread across the areas where we're having the most impact and reporting how we're doing against those. Also report on our different areas of emission. So we report our full scope 3 emissions. We report that every year in our climate related disclosure report, which is publicly available. We have some pretty graphs around where that impact's coming from and how that all totals up. Again, just some key metrics that we report back to our 2019 baseline around our emissions, around our energy, our water, our paper, and our waste. So really trying to be transparent around our journey to date, the impacts that we're having. And we also have narrative in our reports around just how we've achieved that. What are we doing to drive that impact? What are we doing to reduce our emissions or our energy or our paper? What steps have we taken? So that transparency and being able to substantiate everything that we say. So, we might say we've installed LED lighting in this branch that's delivered this amount of energy savings, or we can substantiate exactly where that impact's come from. And then finally, for us as a large organisation, we have regulatory reporting requirements. So this is one called our Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, where because of the size of our organisation, one of the UK legislations is that we have to report our carbon emissions as well as our energy consumption, split into UK and then global other, as well as that total piece. So we kind of have legal reporting obligations. So that's all from me. I thought I'd end on a quick quiz just to summarize the impact that hopefully this session's have. So, has your knowledge on this topic, do you feel like that's changed over the course of this? Have you maybe moved from I'm unsure to beginner or beginner to moderate? And if you feel more confident in tracking your sustainability metrics as well. So, are you able now to begin that journey? Are you sort of able to, you kind of understand the metrics a bit more now, but you might need a bit more help in practice when it comes to actually tracking that or actually doing those calculations? Or are you still a little bit unclear on what metrics might be best for your business or what metrics might matter most for your business?